very much. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I should say right at the outset that this is not a talk about how you can make money in the next 10 seconds. It's much more, since you're all at an academic institution, I thought I should orient my talk to some of the puzzles relating to interest rates. I won't use too many slides, but essentially I thought I'd begin by reminding you of the obvious, which is rates are incredibly low. So this, of course, is a picture I'm sure your teachers have all shown you of policy rates in the UK. And they are unusually low and have been low for a long time. I mean, we've even had a member of the MPC serving his 2 full terms of 6 years and never voting to increase interest rates. And if you look at the world real interest rate, it too is unusually low. Yeah. So now the issue is this all somehow the fact that central bankers are all using the wrong theory and setting rates too low? Or is it the case that there are more fundamental forces in the world economy which have conspired to keep rates low? And the reason I say this is that I think you'd find remarkably few central bankers who back in 2009, 2010 would have said that rates would remain as low as they have been in subsequent years. Obviously, global central banks responded aggressively after the financial crisis and they slashed rates. But most people thought that this was a cyclical response to what had happened and that rates would indeed, gradually drift back towards normal levels. And I think what most people have learned over the last 5 or 6 years is there are powerful structural forces which are bearing down on interest rates. And to some extent, it is as if many of the developed economies have in some sense turned Japanese. And why do I say that? I say that because, of course, Japan got to effectively zero interest rates back in 1997. And even though they've tried on a couple of occasions to escape from zero rates by putting rates up, those efforts have been unsuccessful on each occasion. Each time they put them up and they came back down. Because essentially the evolution of the economy forced that upon the central bankers. So here we are 18 years later in Japan, rates are still low and there's no real sign of them going up. If anything, in Japan, the central bank is talking of further stimulus through quantitative easing. So why are rates so low? And they were essentially, in a textbook model, there'd be 2 reasons. In a textbook model, interest rates are determined by investment behavior and savings behavior. So one possibility is that in the last few years, what's happened is there's been a drop in investment demand, or alternatively, there's been an increase in essentially the demand for savings. And of course, like most two-handed economists, it's probably been a bit of both. Now, you can see empirically that investment as a share of GDP has been coming down on trend. So over the last 25 years, the investment share of GDP has fallen from between 25 and 30% of GDP to a little below 20%. So there's clearly been a trend decline in investment. But that's an outcome. It's not the ex ante demand. Now, what are the factors which could have led to higher savings rates and lower investment demand. In terms of savings rates, there are several factors, but what I highlight are, one, there has been a hangover from the financial crisis. The financial crisis came as a shock to many people. They didn't realize that such bad outcomes were possible. And for that reason, it's not surprising that you've got a lot more precautionary saving than you used to have. I won't bore you with all the details, but I have slides if anyone is interested later on where I can show you the evidence for that. A second factor is, I'm sure you've all heard and read a lot about Thomas Piketty's work on income inequality. But one implication of the rise of inequality is that with more and more money in the hands of the very rich, the ultra-rich, the overall propensity to consume in the economy has fallen. Because obviously the ultra-rich have a very high propensity to save as well. So if you look over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been this trend, increase in inequality in most developed countries, and as a result, savings ratios have gone up in the aggregate. There are also essentially reasons to do with China's emergence and demographics, and we can come back to that later on if it's of interest to people. I just wanted to give you a quick overview. And then in terms of investment, again, the financial crisis figures, in the sense that we've seen businesses globally become much more risk averse after the financial crisis. And they're much less likely to invest because for them now future outcomes are much more uncertain than they used to think they were before the financial crisis. And therefore, you find corporates globally hoard a lot more cash, and they're much less likely to invest than they used to be. Over and above that, there have been simple factors like the price of capital has been on a trend decline. And you can see that from a simple thing like the price of computers, which of course are much more affordable now than they used to be when I was a student. So when I was a student back in 1980, when I was an undergraduate, there were no recognizable laptops. What we had was a mainframe computer. And a lot of the routine computations that you're all carrying out now, we had to essentially carry out by using these punch cards. And we dutifully carry our punch cards over to the computer operator, go and have a cup of coffee and come back in half an hour and get your result. And if you made a mistake, you then had to repeat the exercise. And in those days, mainframes cost a lot of money. But I just use that as a simple example. Very generally, the price of capital goods has come down enormously, especially of high-tech goods. And as a result, the nominal amount of money you have to spend on investment has diminished meaningfully. And a fact that I'm going to come back to later is globally you have much weaker productivity growth. For reasons that we don't fully understand, productivity growth, at least as measured, has slowed meaningfully. And as a result of that, corporates are much less likely to invest. In the old days when productivity growth was high, it seemed appropriate, because that boosted the return on capital, it then made it more likely that you were going to invest. So that's just a quick overview. Feel free to interrupt me as I go along. If you don't understand something, don't be shy. It's probably the way I said it. I'm happy to try to explain. Yeah? Okay. Now, all the factors I've mentioned are sort of medium-term secular reasons as to why rates are so low. Now, the question that was posed to me was, what did I think would happen to interest rates in the coming years? Now, one sinister possibility that I want to leave you with, and it's only a possibility, but something which is being widely discussed both by academics and in policy circles, is a hypothesis called secular stagnation. I'm not sure if it's something that you've been taught on your courses. If you haven't anyway, what I'll do is I'll give you a quick 2-minute summary of what that's all about. It's essentially the view that the economy can get trapped into a kind of low-level equilibrium where there isn't enough demand. And the reason that you might get trapped into that equilibrium is that the equilibrium real interest rate might actually be negative. However, with what until now we regard as a zero lower bound to interest rates, I'll come back to negative interest rates later in the talk. But if you think you've got a zero lower bound, and if inflation happens to be 1 or 2%, then the real rate can't go below -1 or -2. Yeah? And if the equilibrium real interest rate that the economy wants is, say, -4, you've got a problem, because you're not attaining equilibrium. And that's what the secular stagnationists argue. Sorry, I apologize for that. It's an old hypothesis. It goes back to Professor Hansen in the 1930s at Harvard. It's been resurrected by Professor Larry Summers more recently. And I mean, his view essentially, we won't waste time on the detail. His view is that you can get locked into this low-level equilibrium. And he would argue that this explains why Japan has performed so poorly over the last 20 years. And that why this might in fact be the future for the US, the UK, and so on. That you can have a little cyclical sense, but in a medium-term sense you might get locked into this low-level equilibrium. Now, if he's right, then rates are going to remain low for many years to come. I mean, the Fed might put them up 2 or 3 times in the next year, but after that, they may be forced to cut again, and rates could remain low for a long time. So it's important to think about whether this hypothesis might be correct. Now, there's been an intense debate in the profession and amongst policymakers about the validity of this hypothesis. I won't go into all the intricacies, but essentially it all turns on whether you believe that it's possible for real interest rates to be negative for very long without it stimulating a lot of investment demand. Textbook theory says that it should stimulate a lot of investment demand. The difficulty we've got, both by observing Japan and our recent experience, is that it doesn't seem to be happening. So there is a genuine puzzle there, and therefore there is indeed a significant possibility that rates remain low for a while. If that all sounds a bit abstract, let me elaborate on why I place some weight on this hypothesis. Look at this picture. This picture shows you the Federal Reserve's forecasts for GDP growth for each of these given years. And they start making the forecast 2 or 3 years ahead of time. Yeah. So if I can talk you through the picture. So look at that brown line, which shows 2012. So the Federal Reserve back in 2010 said that the 2012 GDP number was 4%. But as time went on, as it got closer to 2012, they brought the number down. And it ended up at around 2%. Yeah? The same thing happened to their 2011 forecast. They started at 4, and it actually came in a little bit over 2. Can everyone see this picture? Yeah. Look at 2013. They started at 4 again. 2011. 4 must be a magic number in the Fed model. And it gradually came down, and it came in about 2.25. And I can carry on. This has happened to every single forecast they've made in the last few years. You see exactly the same pattern if you look at the Bank of Japan from about 1997 onwards. Year after year, growth disappointed. What this is saying is that the economies are behaving very differently from how they used to behave. But here you've got these very clever people, systematically, year after year, making the same forecasting errors. The economies are just not performing in line with what our model said. Now this is key, because people like Larry Summers say that this is key evidence that we're falling into secular stagnation. That we are in a regime where it's very difficult to generate a lot of growth. If they're right, then interest rates are actually going to remain low for many, many years to come, on average. What I now want to tell you is about a risk that even if the secular stagnation hypothesis is correct, and if it turns out that looking forward over the next 10 years, on average interest rates turn out to be low, I think there is a very significant short-term risk. And by short-term I mean the next year or so, that interest rates go up in the US a lot more than people think. I hope this is not too confusing. I want to explain that what I just said about going up relates to the short-term business cycle and the likely evolution of inflation. And what I'm saying in terms of interest rates over the next 10 years relating to secular stagnation is about medium-term influence. Yeah. Anyone wants to ask me a question? Please do. Don't be shy. I definitely don't bite. Is it all clear, or is it clear as mud? Please.
Do you think policymakers get better at predicting? Because it looks like they're not starting off so aggressive and high.
Yep. Certainly. I mean, they've begun to learn that you don't start at 4 for a start. And that actually the economy may have a lower potential growth rate. So, to be fair, Janet Yellen, in a couple of speeches this year, has talked about the significant possibility that long-term growth in the US is likely to be lower than what we're accustomed to. So people are definitely learning. But in that same speech, she talked about the possibility that the secular stagnation people are right. She said she didn't know whether they were right, but you had to take the hypothesis seriously. Okay. I now want to spend about 5 minutes. You're going to prompt me when I run out of time, yes? Okay. On why interest rates might go up more than the market is thinking over the next 12 to 18 months. But then that turns out to be a policy mistake, and then the secular stagnation people might turn out to be correct. So I think my most likely path for interest rates is complex in that sense. But I want to explain why I have that belief. Okay. Sorry, I'm skipping a lot of stuff. You know what? I'll leave that slide up there, but don't waste your time on it if it looks complicated. The argument is absurdly simple. Yeah. So, just give me 1 minute to develop it. In the US, the unemployment rate currently is around 5%. 5 years ago, the unemployment rate was 10%. When the unemployment rate was 10%, everybody agreed that the US economy had a lot of spare capacity and that a lot of people were underemployed. Now that it's at 5%, a number of people, including senior people at the Fed, think that we're essentially at full employment. They think of 5% as the so-called NAIRU, natural rate of unemployment. I don't know if it's a concept you're familiar with. So at 5%, they think that we're now around levels where if unemployment keeps falling, then wage inflation will accelerate. And because wage inflation will accelerate, price inflation will follow. And because of that, and because they have an inflation target, they need to raise rates. That is why it's highly likely that rates will go up next month. I don't know what people answered here, but we'll see your answers. So it's highly likely that they'll raise rates because unemployment's now at 5, which is the Fed's own view of where the equilibrium unemployment rate is. Okay? Now, what is the risk that interest rates not only go up in December, but have to go up quite a lot in 2016? The market at the moment assumes that rates will only go up 2 more times in 2016. So the market's assuming around an 85% probability that rates go up in December, and then they're assuming about 100% probability that they'll go up 2 more times in 2016. Once by June, and then once later in 2016. Yeah. So the market thinks rates by the end of 2016 will only be about 75 basis points higher than that. I think that view, irrespective of whether or not you believe in secular stagnation, because that's a medium-term story, I think that view has a good chance of being wrong. Why do I think it's got a very good chance of being wrong? I think that because essentially the consensus forecast for GDP growth next year and the year after is around 2.5% in the US. Not an unreasonable forecast. Yeah, so we're no longer looking for 4s, we're looking for 2 and a bit. However, the potential growth rate of the US economy has almost certainly fallen, which we've seen in the numbers. Yeah. So the potential growth rate of the US economy, depending on who you believe, and that's why I put that slide up, is somewhere between 1.6 and 2. So if the economy grows at 2.5, it's growing faster than potential. If it grows faster than potential, that means that the unemployment rate will keep falling. If the unemployment rate keeps falling and now falls below the natural rate, that's going to lead to more inflation, other things being equal. Yeah. And it's going to, and the key thing is that the Fed will think it's going to lead to more inflation, even if it doesn't. And for that reason, it's going to put pressure on the Fed to tighten by more than the market thinks. I hope this is not too confusing a story. Put your hand up if you didn't get what I was saying. Please, don't be embarrassed. Is it all? Please, tell me so.
So you talk about the potential GDP, which is 1.6%. Is that your expectation?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I skipped a couple of slides, but it seems to me the people who understand potential growth best in the US are somewhere in that range now. They're somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8. The Fed is a bit higher. The Fed's at 2. But the Fed, right through this period, has moved very slowly, as you saw from their numbers. So, please.
Would you say it's better for perhaps to predict that inflation will rise and therefore tighten policy, or wait for it to rise in reality and then take action?
That's an excellent question. People like Larry Summers argue that you should wait to see the whites of inflation's eyes and tighten at that point. The danger with that strategy is that if you leave it too late, I mean, suppose Janet Yellen listens to her and says, yeah, unemployment's coming down, it's 4.5%, in 6 months' time, 4% in 12 months' time. But we're relaxed, we haven't seen any inflation yet. The risk with that, historically, is that once inflation starts rising, it rises very quickly. So if you look historically, both in the US and the UK, once it gets embedded into higher inflation expectations, it goes up remarkably quickly. And when it does that, you then have to really tighten a lot to push unemployment up, to bring wage inflation down again. And in doing that, you almost certainly risk creating a recession. I don't know if you guys use the Dornbush Fisher textbook anymore, or that's so 1990s now, isn't it? So Dornbush Fisher used to be the best-selling macro textbook globally. I forget how many millions of copies it used to sell. Rudy Dornbush used to always argue, the late Rudy Dornbush used to always argue that essentially recessions don't happen because the economy gets into one through natural causes. They happen because the Fed murders the economy. Now, that's no longer true, by the way. But anyway, historically, when Rudy was writing that, he was making a good point, in the sense most post-World War II recessions in the US until about 1992 occurred because the Fed had to respond to rising inflation and really slam on the brakes and tighten very sharply. And then that would destabilize the economy and push it into a recession. And that's the risk you would run if you wait for inflation to pick up. And that's why Janet Yellen argues so strongly that she should be tightening preemptively. Piyusha, am I running out of time?
How are you doing?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
10
Yeah,
minutes.
okay, that's good. Okay. Because I then want to go on to my next favorite subject. Is everyone okay? So what I've said so far is I think there's a risk that rates rise faster than the markets think over the next 18 months. But I think thereafter, the risks actually reside the other way. Now let me explain why I think the risks reside the other way thereafter. Which is, I think if rates go up more than people think, given the economies are already, now flying at lower altitude, the risk of a recession goes up. Yeah. And if we end up having a recession, say 2 years from now, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we've actually got remarkably little policy ammo. In the developed world anyway. So if you look around the developed world, rates are low many places. So there's not a lot that monetary policy can do. And fiscal policy in many countries is maxed out. Fiscal debt to GDP ratios are very high. So you've got a situation where if, say, we got a recession in the US or the UK 2 years from now, policymakers can do much less than they could do before. That is why policymakers are now spending a lot of time thinking about what it is they could do if a recession occurred. So what I'm going to share with you now is not necessarily a prediction, but it's certainly a summary of where I see the policy debate, and therefore where I think ultimately it's likely we'll end up. I'm not talking the next 016 or 017, I'm really looking beyond that. So bear with me, if you will. I'll skip a few slides, but I want to take you to the land of negative interest rates at the policy end and the land of helicopter drops. I don't know how much you can talk about that, but they're both very simple notions. So, there is now a very active debate amongst policymakers about how you can change the monetary system to make rates at the short end heavily negative. Now remember that short-term interest rates have already gone negative in the last year or two in several European countries. Yeah. So the ECB, the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, the policy rate currently is minus 20 basis points. And it's highly likely that in December that will go to either minus 30 or minus 40. Yeah. In Denmark, interest rates are already minus 50. Sweden, if I remember correctly, they're minus 35. And in Switzerland, they're minus 75. Now, one of the side effects of this is that in Denmark, you can now get a mortgage and pay no interest on it. Did you know that? It's amazing. I mean, if you told me that 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. But there are now banks willing to give you a mortgage, and they don't charge you any interest. So it's an interest-free mortgage. Because, of course, the policy rate is negative in Denmark. Yeah. Now, what policymakers are deeply worried about, incidentally, Switzerland rates have got to minus 75, and not much has happened. You know, a lot of people 2 or 3 years ago used to argue that if rates get to minus 75, then people will stop using banks, they'll just hold cash at home, and banks would have a big problem. But the Swiss banks haven't noticed much of a problem yet. It may be coming. I think it's likely next month they take it to minus 100. And at some point, surely consumers will react. Yeah, we don't know quite where that point is, but there will surely be a point where people will say, I'm not going to bother with my bank deposits, where actually by putting money in a bank I lose money every month. Because instead of paying me interest, they charge me to keep money in a bank. I'd rather hold it as cash. Yeah. Because of that, policymakers are now beginning to worry about what institutional change is needed if, say, in a recession, in the UK we needed rates at minus 200 basis points. Quite plausible. You know, on average, when the UK economy goes into a recession, the Bank of England lowers interest rates by 400, 450 basis points. At the moment, rates are plus 50 basis points, that's all. If, say, a recession occurs after rates here have got to plus 200, ideally we want to get to minus 200. You know, if you're going to turn the economy around. Do we know we can do minus 200 without people deserting banks? Not really. So we would almost certainly need institutional change. So what sort of institutional change is being debated? Well, the chief economist of the Bank of England said this was the most powerful argument for having e-money. I don't know how seriously to take him, but obviously if you move to e-money away from cash, then it simplifies things. You can then have minus 500 basis points as your interest rate if you abolish cash. But I don't think any government this side of a recession is ready to abolish cash. So I'm going to ignore that possibility. Second possibility, which I think the Swiss are considering very seriously, is to tax holdings of bank notes. So that's a possibility. Again, politically incredibly difficult, but it's being talked about. third possibility is that you create an exchange rate between cash and bank deposits. Yeah. And what you do is, because you want to penalize people from holding cash, because you want them to hold bank deposits so that you can levy a negative interest rate on them, you announce, the central bank announces, that the exchange rate between cash and bank deposits is 0.9 to 1. Yeah. And you change that exchange rate every month, depending on what the economy is. I mean, these are very, very old ideas. I don't see any of them happening before the economies lapse back into very deep recession. Because no politician is going to have the courage to do this. But I think what is going on is more covert. So they're putting pressure on insurance companies. I've gone on too long, haven't I? Sorry. You want me to stop?
A few moments.
You sure?
Yeah.
Sorry. You can't stop me talking. Okay. I just thought this might be of interest to you because it's something that I think will be very much in the news sort of 2 or 3 years down the road. I think this will become a very big deal during and after the next recession. So I will resist the temptation to say anything about Corbynomics, which I was going to say a little bit about. And we can pick that up in questions if you want. I mean, the bit about Corbynomics I was going to talk about was helicopter money. But I'll leave that for Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wadhwani, for that all-encompassing talk, I have to say. We'd like to open the floor to any questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation today, Doctor. I just have a bit long question, please excuse me.
Yes, please.
The question is, how far would the FOMC interest rate decision from America affect the MPC interest rate decision here in England? And do MPC minute or voting count here in Britain affect more to FOMC decision, or do FOMC affect more to MPC?
You're going to make me give a politically incorrect answer. Obviously, the US is a much larger economy than the UK, and US decisions have a huge impact on global financial markets. Now, the main channel through which the UK MPC would care about the US decision would be through the exchange rate. So, essentially, if hypothetically the Fed surprises everybody and doesn't move in December, yeah, but the UK MPC still wanted to raise rates, say in Jan or Feb, other things being equal, they'd be more reluctant to do that, because if the Fed surprises people and doesn't raise rates, the pound will go up. And if the pound goes up, then that bears down on UK inflation. So in a very mechanical way, the MPC then has less need to put rates up. So in that very mechanical sense, the Fed feeds through directly into the decision because it affects the exchange rate. Does it matter over and above that? They'll tell you no, but maybe it has some psychological effect on decision. In terms of the other way around, I don't think we should kid ourselves. I don't think they're too worried about what the UK does. We're just a small economy to them.
Building on your idea that these policies that could be discussed in the future are very hard to do unless you have a very deep recession. So I was just wondering, how different is the idea of circular stagnation from Keynesian involuntary demand ideas that were used to explain the Great Depression.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. The secular stagnation hypothesis also dates back to the 30s. It was Alvin Hansen, professor at Harvard. Obviously, he was writing a year after Keynes. He was deeply influenced by Keynes. It's just that, I don't want to get into hot water with any of your teachers by saying my interpretation of Keynes, since we know there are hundreds of interpretations of Keynes. But I think Keynesian sort of involuntary unemployment, if you like, came really mainly from imperfections, in that case, in the labor market. Or if you don't want to call them imperfections, efficiency wage theory or whatever we call it nowadays. Yeah? While the Hansen hypothesis was much more about there not being enough demand in the world. Now, of course, it's linked to Keynes' stuff, because if you have a labor market imperfection, the labor market isn't clear, that then leads to deficient demand. But for Keynes, it came from the labor market. For Hansen, it's coming from other sources. For Hansen, it's coming from insufficient investment demand in the Hague. So it's a subtle difference. Yeah, is that okay?
Yes.
Please.
So the Fed quite often talk about, for instance, like a Taylor rule when they're making their policy decisions.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think there's any point in paying attention to this rule, or would you advise maybe more complex rules to follow when making policy decisions, or would you say that there's no point in looking at what's
Okay. To be fair to the Fed, they mention the Taylor rule as a kind of benchmark, and then they give you 10 reasons why they should be away from it. Not all of which, as you rightly point out, are built into the rule. So there are two ways of doing it. Either you go to a much more complex rule, or you just say, we all, in various areas of our lives, use benchmarks of some kind, and then decide why we're going to aim off that benchmark. And I think that's really the best way to think about the Taylor rule. And the sinister thing about the Taylor rule is there are congressmen who want to legislate to get the Fed to religiously follow the Taylor rule. That would be suicidal. What that would have meant during the height of the financial crisis is that rates would have stayed too high. And we wouldn't have got the kind of recovery we got. But it's a benchmark. But people are realizing that it's too simple. This may be a little complex, but I do have a slide about it. Do I have 1 minute to show you why I think things are much more complex? Sorry. Okay. So, in the old days, and most Taylor rule formulations assume that the equilibrium interest rate is constant. So if the equilibrium interest rate is constant, then the left-hand side picture becomes relevant. So what the Taylor rule does is it looks at where inflation is relative to target, where unemployment is in relation to target, or where the output gap is, depending on your formulation. And then you're either above or below the equilibrium rate, and then you know what to do. The difficulty in the real world is the equilibrium rate moves about a lot. That's this picture. And the Taylor rule doesn't recognize that. The Taylor rule assumes a constant equilibrium rate. If the equilibrium rate is moving about, life is much, much more complicated. Did that help? Or confuse? Yeah?
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah?
One last question? Yeah.
In terms of the secondary stagnation, in terms of with that being taken more seriously, how likely do you think it is that will actually increase their votes in the upcoming meetings more than what's expected? and what circumstances can you see actually deciding lengths of rates? And what are the reasons?
Now, if the hike rate will be 7, which I think is highly likely, it will be the first rate hike after a long time. The first rate hike is 6 or 7. I forgot. I'm almost certain about that fact wrong, but I think it was 07. Anyway, many years. So it's most unlikely they'll do more than 25, because they don't want to shock anybody. They want everyone to be completely prepared, so they don't get anyone complaining. So I think the first rate hike will be fine. What's the risk that they don't hike in December? I think we need something like August and September to happen again. Like the markets to get volatile, weak. But not just the markets. I don't think the markets by themselves will be enough to stop them this time. In August we had news out of China, which is what stopped them. Unless you get a significant amount of news out of China, I think they won't have this time. They don't want to, having prepared the markets now, they don't want to the other bit of your question is, how does secular stagnation play into this? I think it plays into it in the sense that they want to then go gently. The risk, though, they're running is that if unemployment keeps falling quickly and wages show signs of picking up, they won't be able to go gently, irrespective of what they think about secular stagnation. And what you've got to remember is that the central bank has to target inflation. And sometimes what happens is, even though you think the medium-term trend of interest rates is down, in a shorter-term sense, you have to think quite a lot to meet the inflation target. Again, you won't be old enough to remember this, but 1994 was a case in point. The Chairman Greenspan at the Fed gave a lot of speeches in 92 and 93 about why long-term interest rates are going to go down for secular reasons. But then in 94 he doubled interest rates. I think they went from 3, in fact more than that. They went from 3% to 6.5%. Because inflation really took off suddenly. I mean, that comes back to an earlier question that was asked, which is if you leave it late, you're so behind the curve. And you've got to move really quickly. So he started in 94, I remember in February with 25 hikes. He then went to 50 big hikes, then went to 75 big hikes. So he was so far behind the curve. And then he had to stop because the economy weakened so much. He stopped suddenly in February 95 because he was surprised at how much the economy weakened. If you more than double interest rates, you create a bit of a shock.
Unfortunately, that's the time that we have for questions.
Okay, everyone. Firstly, on behalf of the World Economic Summit, we would like to thank you all for coming to the event this evening, and it's very much appreciated that you come to these West Presents events. And in particular, we would like to thank you, Dr. Wadhwani, for coming to give such insightful talk this evening. Thank you very much.